Marcus's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he watched Zeus's bizarre behavior unfold. In his 18 months as head of palace security, he'd never seen the notoriously aggressive shepherd display such uncertainty. Zeus was a weapon with 4 legs and fangs, trained to attack first and ask questions never, yet here he stood, trembling like a spooked house cat. "Easy, boy," Marcus called softly, his voice cutting through the fog. The dog's ears swiveled toward him, but Zeus remained fixated on that empty space beside Marcus's wheelchair, a space where absolutely nothing existed except damp November air and gathering shadows. Marcus wheeled closer, the rubber of his tires silent against the wet cobblestones. His phantom limbs, those ghostly sensations where his legs used to be, began their familiar burning dance. Dr. Richardson had warned him that stress triggered the phantom pain, but 3 years of therapy hadn't diminished the cruel joke his nervous system played on him daily. Right now, those non-existent legs felt like they were being dipped in acid. "Zeus, what's got you spooked?" He stopped his chair 15 feet from the bench, close enough to see the intricate carvings worn smooth by centuries of weather. The bench had always struck him as oddly placed, tucked into an alcove between the chapel and the old servants' quarters, too isolated for casual use, too ornate for purely functional seating. Palace historians loved to ramble about its significance, something about Princess Charlotte and the tragic circumstances of her death in 1817, but Marcus had never paid much attention to ghost stories. Until now. Zeus suddenly went rigid, his growl cutting off mid-rumble. The silence that followed felt dense, almost solid. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as the dog's posture shifted completely. The aggression melted away, replaced by something Marcus had never witnessed from Zeus before: reverence. The shepherd's tail began wagging slowly, tentatively, as if greeting someone he both feared and adored. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. The fog seemed to thicken around them, creating an intimate pocket of isolation within the vast courtyard. Street lamps flickered on automatically, their yellow glow struggling to penetrate the mist. Marcus checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. The evening shift change had just completed, meaning he was alone out here for at least another 20 minutes before the next patrol sweep. He rolled his wheelchair another few feet closer to the bench, his security training warring with something else, a pull he couldn't name. Zeus watched his approach with what could only be described as anticipation, the dog's intelligent brown eyes darting between Marcus and that mysterious empty space. "You're losing it, Thorn," Marcus muttered to himself. Talking to a dog about invisible threats, Dr. Richardson would have a field day. But even as he tried to rationalize the situation, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the courtyard's atmosphere. The air felt charged, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. His phantom limbs began tingling instead of burning, a sensation he'd never experienced before. The cold bit through his thick wool coat, reminding him that he should return to the security office to complete his evening reports. Tomorrow's schedule was packed: a diplomatic reception, 3 tour groups, and a security briefing for next month's coronation preparations. The coronation, an event that had consumed his every waking moment for the past 6 months. Coordinating protection for the royal family during such a public ceremony was a logistical nightmare, made worse by intelligence reports suggesting increased chatter among extremist groups. Marcus had already identified 14 potential security vulnerabilities and was working with MI5 to address each one. His reputation for thoroughness had earned him this position despite his disability, or perhaps because of it. A man who'd sacrificed his legs for the crown understood the stakes better than most. But sitting here in the fog, watching Zeus's inexplicable behavior, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since the bombing: uncertainty about what was real and what was trauma playing tricks on his mind. Zeus took 3 deliberate steps forward and sat perfectly at attention beside the stone bench, his gaze still fixed on that empty space next to Marcus's wheelchair. The dog's tail continued its slow, respectful wagging, and his expression held an almost human quality of patient waiting. "Waiting for what?" Marcus asked aloud, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but somehow significant. Marcus found himself studying the bench more carefully, noting details he'd previously overlooked, the way the carved roses seemed to catch and hold shadows, the small brass plaque set into the armrest that was too tarnished to read in this light, the way the fog seemed to swirl differently around the stone, as if disturbed by an unseen presence. His radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Captain Thorne, this is Control. Status report on the evening sweep." Marcus reached for the device clipped to his belt, but hesitated. How exactly did he report this? That the palace's attack dog was acting like a perfectly trained gentleman in the presence of absolutely nothing? "Control, this is Thorne. Everything's quiet out here." "Quiet, but not normal. Not normal at all." "Understood, Captain. Report to the main office when you've completed the perimeter check." "Copy that." Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and found himself reluctant to leave. Zeus remained motionless beside the bench, his vigil unwavering. "Come on, boy. Let's get you back to the kennels." The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. For a moment, Marcus considered ordering him to heel, but something about the shepherd's focused attention made him hesitate. Instead, he turned his wheelchair around and headed back toward the castle's main entrance, expecting Zeus to follow. He didn't. Marcus paused at the courtyard's edge and looked back. Through the thickening fog, he could just make out Zeus's silhouette, still sitting ramrod straight beside that damned bench. Shaking his head, Marcus continued inside, but the image lingered in his mind like an unresolved chord. The security office buzzed with its usual evening activity. Officer Janet Mills looked up from her bank of monitors as Marcus entered, her graying hair pulled back in its customary bun. She'd worked palace security for 15 years and had been one of the few staff members who'd treated Marcus the same after his injury, professionally respectful with just enough maternal concern to make him feel human rather than heroic. "How was the patrol?" she asked, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she updated the duty log. "Fine. Quiet." Marcus wheeled to his desk and powered up his computer. Zeus was acting strange near the old bench by the chapel. Might want to have the veterinarian check him tomorrow. "Strange how?" Janet's eyebrows knitted together. "That dog doesn't do strange. He does attack or ignore. Those are his two settings. He was just fixated on something. Probably nothing. Maybe caught a scent from the kitchens." Marcus pulled up his evening reports, trying to push the image from his mind. But his fingers hovered over the keyboard as he struggled to focus on incident logs and security updates. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah. "Dinner Sunday. Emma's been asking about Uncle Marcus. She wants to show you her new painting." Marcus smiled despite himself. His 8-year-old niece was one of the few people who looked at his wheelchair and saw only a really cool chair with wheels. Their Sunday dinners had become a lifeline after the bombing, the one place where he could shed Captain Thorne and just be Marcus again. Sarah's husband, Tom, would cook. Emma would chatter endlessly about school, and for a few hours the weight of protecting the crown would lift from his shoulders. "Wouldn't miss it," he typed back. "Tell Emma I hope she painted something more cheerful than last time." Her previous masterpiece had featured stick figures in what she'd proudly announced was Uncle Marcus's Big Boom Day. Sarah had gone pale, but Marcus had hung it on his refrigerator anyway. Children, he'd learned, processed trauma differently than adults. Sometimes their honesty was exactly what he needed. "Captain?" Officer Davis approached his desk, a stack of files in his hands. "Tomorrow's diplomatic reception roster needs your approval. And MI5 called about the coronation security briefing. They want to move it up to Thursday." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache building. The coronation was still weeks away, but every day brought new complications. Guest lists that changed hourly, security protocols that needed constant revision, intelligence reports that painted increasingly dire pictures of potential threats. He'd been sleeping 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee and stubborn determination. "Any specific concerns from MI5?" he asked, scanning the roster Davis had handed him. The usual. Chatter from Republican groups, possible foreign interference, lone wolf actors. Davis lowered his voice. "They're also worried about inside threats, want expanded background checks on any staff hired in the past year." Inside threats. Marcus's phantom limbs gave a sharp twinge. 3 years ago he'd believed palace security was impenetrable. Then Mohammed al-Rashid had walked through the main gate, wearing a legitimate visitor's badge, and detonated a suicide vest 30 feet from the royal apartments. The blast had brought down part of the east wall, killed 2 other guards, and turned Marcus's legs into a mangled mess of bone and tissue. They'd rebuilt the wall, upgraded the screening procedures, installed new detection equipment. But Marcus knew the truth that kept him awake at night. Absolute security was an illusion. Every day was a calculated risk, every face in a crowd a potential threat. The weight of that responsibility had nearly broken him during those first months in the wheelchair, watching from his hospital bed as new guards took over his duties. Now, he channeled that awareness into hypervigilance. His injury had cost him his legs, but sharpened his instincts. He saw threats others missed, anticipated vulnerabilities others ignored. It was why the palace had offered him this position, not charity for a wounded hero, but recognition that his sacrifice had transformed him into something more valuable than he'd been before. Still, moments like tonight in the courtyard made him question everything. PTSD could manifest in countless ways. Dr. Richardson had warned him. Hypervigilance could cross the line into paranoia, stress could trigger hallucinations. Was Zeus's strange behavior real, or was Marcus's damaged mind finally creating threats where none existed? The thought terrified him more than any bomber ever could. Marcus stared at the blinking cursor on his computer screen, but his mind kept drifting back to Zeus's vigil in the courtyard. The dog's behavior gnawed at him like phantom pain, persistent, inexplicable, impossible to ignore. He'd built his career on reading situations, on trusting his instincts about threats and anomalies. But what did you call it, when the anomaly defied all logic? "Sir?" Officer Davis was still waiting by his desk, the diplomatic roster clutched in his hands. "Right, the reception." Marcus forced himself to focus on the familiar ritual of reviewing security assignments, checking credentials, noting potential vulnerabilities. But even as he initialed each page, part of his attention remained fixed on that empty courtyard. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Dr. Sarah Richardson stood in the doorway, her silver hair catching the fluorescent lights. The palace psychologist made regular rounds to check on security staff, officially part of the Crown's wellness initiative. Unofficially, everyone knew she was there specifically for Marcus. "Evening, Captain. Heard you were working late again." Her tone was casual, but Marcus caught the subtle assessment in her eyes. 3 years of sessions had taught him to recognize when she was in professional mode. "Just catching up on paperwork." He gestured to his desk, which was indeed buried under files and reports. "The coronation prep never ends." "I'm sure." She moved closer, her voice lowering. "Janet mentioned you seemed unsettled after tonight's patrol. Anything you'd like to discuss?" There it was, the careful probing that marked the beginning of every session. Marcus felt a familiar bristle of resistance. How could he explain Zeus's behavior without sounding like he was having a breakdown? How could he describe the feeling that something significant had happened in that courtyard when absolutely nothing had occurred? One of the dogs was acting unusual. Probably nothing. He turned back to his computer, hoping she'd take the hint. Instead, Dr. Richardson pulled up a chair beside his desk. "Zeus, I assume." Janet said he was fixated on something near the old chapel bench. Marcus's fingers stilled on the keyboard. "You know about the bench?" "Of course. Princess Charlotte's memorial. Tragic story. Young woman, barely 21, found dead there in 1817. Palace legend says she still walks the grounds." Richardson's expression remained neutral. These old buildings are full of such stories. History has weight here, especially for those carrying their own burdens. The words hit closer to home than Marcus cared to admit. You think I'm projecting? Seeing ghosts because I'm stressed about the coronation? I think you're a man who survived a traumatic event and now carries the immense responsibility of preventing others from experiencing the same trauma. That kind of pressure can manifest in unexpected ways. Marcus wheeled his chair back from the desk, needing space. Zeus saw something too. Are we having a shared hallucination? Animals are remarkably sensitive to environmental changes. Electromagnetic fields, subsonic vibrations, chemical traces we can't detect. What seems supernatural often has perfectly rational explanations. Dr. Richardson leaned forward slightly, but regardless of the cause, if something is troubling you, we should talk about it. Before Marcus could respond, his radio crackled again. This time, the voice belonged to Officer Mills, and there was tension in her tone that made his pulse quicken. Captain Thorne, please report to the monitoring station immediately. We have a situation. Marcus was moving before she finished speaking, his wheels spinning against the polished floor as he crossed to the bank of security monitors. Dr. Richardson followed, her professional curiosity overriding protocol. What's the problem, Mills? Marcus positioned himself in front of the central screen, scanning the feeds from around the palace grounds. Camera 7, sir. Courtyard view. Mills's fingers flew across the controls, bringing up the footage from 20 minutes earlier. This is from your patrol tonight. The black and white image showed the courtyard shrouded in fog, the old bench barely visible in the lower right corner. Marcus watched himself wheel into frame, saw Zeus's aggressive posture transform into that strange reverence. But what made his blood run cold was what happened next. On the grainy security footage, Marcus could clearly see himself talking, gesturing animatedly at the empty space beside his wheelchair, nodding as if listening to responses, even laughing at one point. The conversation appeared to last nearly 20 minutes, during which Zeus sat perfectly still, his attention divided between Marcus and something the cameras couldn't capture. I don't remember any of this, Marcus whispered. I was only out there for 5 minutes, 10 at most. The timestamp doesn't lie, sir. Mills rewound the footage, and they watched it again. Marcus engaged in what appeared to be an intense, emotional conversation with thin air, while Zeus observed like a well-trained witness. Dr. Richardson moved closer to the screen. Marcus, do you remember what you were discussing during this conversation? He stared at his own image, watching his lips move in animated discussion. Fragments began surfacing, not memories exactly, but impressions. A woman's voice, cultured and urgent, warnings about danger, something about the coronation. But the harder he tried to grasp the details, the more they slipped away like fog through his fingers. This can't be real, he said finally. I would remember talking to someone for 20 minutes. But even as he spoke, Marcus knew he was facing a choice that would define everything that followed. He could accept Dr. Richardson's rational explanations, submit to increased psychological evaluation, and watch his career end quietly in a cloud of medical concerns. Or he could trust what Zeus had seen, what the cameras had recorded, and follow this impossible thread wherever it led. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the responsibility he'd carried since the bombing. Only this time, the threat wasn't external. It was the very real possibility that his damaged mind was finally betraying him completely. Dr. Richardson's hand settled gently on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a doctor preparing to deliver terminal news than comfort. Marcus, I think we need to schedule some additional sessions. This level of dissociation... No. The word came out sharper than intended. Marcus pulled away from her touch, his wheels squeaking against the floor. I'm not having a breakdown. Lost time, vivid hallucinations, conversations with invisible entities. These are textbook symptoms of severe PTSD episodes. Her voice carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to resistance. After what you've been through, it would be more surprising if you didn't experience some psychological... I said no. Marcus's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles went white. The phantom pain in his missing legs flared, sharp enough to make him wince. "I can't afford to be sidelined right now, not with the coronation 3 weeks away." Officer Mills cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, sir." Marcus looked around the security office, suddenly aware that their entire conversation had an audience. Davis pretended to focus on his paperwork while 2 night shift guards exchanged glances near the coffee station. Word would spread by morning, Captain Thorne losing his grip, talking to ghosts, cracking under pressure. His carefully rebuilt reputation would crumble faster than the palace wall had 3 years ago. "Delete the footage," he said quietly. Sir Mills's eyebrows shot up. "You heard me. Delete tonight's feed from camera 7. Technical malfunction. Happens all the time in this fog. Marcus, that's not..." Dr. Richardson started. "I'm head of security. The footage shows nothing relevant to palace safety, just a man taking a break during his patrol." Marcus met Mills's uncertain gaze. "Delete it." Mills looked between him and Dr. Richardson, clearly torn between following orders and protecting Marcus from himself. "Sir, if there's a medical issue..." "There's no medical issue." But even as he said it, Marcus felt the crushing weight of doubt. 20 minutes of conversation with someone who wasn't there. 20 minutes he couldn't remember. What else might he be forgetting? What other gaps existed in his carefully constructed reality? The coronation security files stared at him from his desk. Hundreds of pages detailing every potential threat, every countermeasure, every contingency plan. His life's work built on the assumption that his mind was sharp, his instincts reliable. But what if Dr. Richardson was right? What if the pressure had finally broken something fundamental inside him? "I need some air." Marcus wheeled toward the door, ignoring Dr. Richardson's concerned calls behind him. The corridors of Windsor Castle stretched before him, familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd walked these halls as a young guard, dreaming of promotion and purpose. Now he rolled through them, haunted by the possibility that everything he'd rebuilt after the bombing was built on shifting sand. His phone buzzed. "A text from Sarah. Emma's painting is of you and her feeding ducks at the pond. She says you look happy in it." The simple message hit him like a physical blow. Happy. When was the last time he'd felt genuinely happy? Before the bombing, certainly. Maybe even for a few moments during those early months of recovery when simply surviving felt like victory. But now he lived in a constant state of controlled anxiety, hypervigilance dressed up as professional dedication. What if this break from reality was his mind's way of telling him he couldn't carry this weight anymore? Marcus found himself outside the personnel office, staring at the nameplate. Beside the door, Colonel James Whitmore, Deputy Head of Security. Whitmore was competent, experienced, whole. He could handle the coronation preparations. The royal family would be safe in his hands. All Marcus had to do was walk through that door tomorrow morning and submit his resignation. Medical retirement, full pension, the gratitude of a nation. He could disappear into civilian life, spend Sundays with Emma, maybe even sleep through the night again. But the thought of abandoning his post, of letting the terrorists win after all, made his stomach clench with familiar shame. He'd failed to stop the bombing 3 years ago, failed his fellow guards, failed the crown itself. How could he fail them again by walking away when they needed him most? His radio crackled. "All units be advised. Zeus has broken containment from the kennels. Last seen heading toward the inner courtyard." Marcus's blood ran cold. The dog was going back to that bench, back to whatever, or whoever, had captured his attention earlier. And despite every rational thought screaming at him to stay away, Marcus found himself turning his wheelchair toward the courtyard. Because whatever was happening to him, real or imagined, Zeus had seen it too. And maybe, just maybe, that meant Marcus wasn't losing his mind after all. Maybe it meant something far more dangerous was coming. The fog had thickened since his earlier patrol, turning the courtyard into a maze of grey shadows and muffled echoes. Marcus's wheelchair cut through the silence. each rotation of his wheels bringing him closer to a choice he couldn't take back. Behind him lay the rational world of security protocols and medical explanations. Ahead waited Zeus, and whatever impossible truth had drawn the dog back to this place. As he rounded the corner near the chapel, Marcus heard it, a low whine that seemed to vibrate through the stones themselves. Zeus stood exactly where he'd been before, but this time the German shepherd's massive frame was trembling. The dog's ears were pinned back, his tail tucked low, as if he was caught between terror and desperate need. "Easy, boy." Marcus approached slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it? What do you see?" Zeus turned at the sound, his dark eyes reflecting something that looked almost like relief. The dog padded over to Marcus's wheelchair, pressing his warm bulk against the metal frame in a gesture that felt oddly protective. Together they faced the bench. The fog swirled around the weathered stone, and for a moment Marcus could swear he saw the outline of someone sitting there, slight shoulders, the suggestion of period dress, hands folded in eternal patience. His rational mind catalogued the visual tricks fog could play, the way shadows and moisture could create false impressions. But his instincts, honed by years of threat assessment, screamed that something real was happening here. "I know you think I'm losing my mind," he said to the empty air, feeling foolish but compelled to continue. "Hell, maybe I am, but Zeus sees you too, doesn't he, whatever you are?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic beyond the castle walls. Marcus felt the weight of his radio on his belt, knowing that one call would bring the entire security team running. Dr. Richardson would have him under psychiatric evaluation within the hour. His career, his purpose, his last remaining connection to the man he'd been before the bombing, all of it would end in this fog-shrouded courtyard. But Zeus stepped forward, his attention fixed on the bench with laser intensity. The dog's tail began a slow wag, and his ears pricked forward as if listening to something just beyond human hearing. That's when Marcus felt it, not a voice exactly, but a presence that settled around him like a familiar coat. The phantom pain in his legs, constant for 3 years, suddenly eased. The tension he'd carried in his shoulders since the day he'd failed to stop Mohammed al-Rashid began to unwind. For the first time since the bombing, Marcus Thorne felt genuinely at peace. "Charlotte," he whispered, and somehow he knew the name was right. "You're not mad, Captain, though I understand why you might wish you were." The voice came from inside his own mind, cultured and achingly sad. Marcus's hands tightened on his wheelchair grips, but he didn't flee, couldn't flee, because underneath the impossible nature of what was happening, he sensed something else, purpose. "They killed me to prevent a marriage that would have changed the succession, made it look like suicide. Poor mad Princess Charlotte, too weak to bear her losses." The voice carried centuries of suppressed anger. "But death has given me perspective, Captain. I can see the patterns now, the bloodlines and bitter grudges that echo through generations." "What patterns?" Marcus heard himself ask, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "The same family that arranged my murder. They've been patient, building influence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The coronation will give them that chance." Marcus felt his training kick in, overriding his shock. "Give me names, specifics. If there's a real threat—" "Thomas Ashworth. He was my father's secretary then, trusted with intimate family details. His descendant carries the same name, holds a position of similar trust now. The planning began the moment the coronation date was announced." Thomas Ashworth. Marcus knew that name. A mid-level civil servant in the royal household, vetted and cleared for coronation planning. Unremarkable, invisible, perfectly positioned to access sensitive information. He's not working alone. There are others, scattered through the establishment like a cancer that's had 2 centuries to spread. They mean to finish what they started with me, reshape the monarchy according to their vision. Zeus whined softly, pressing closer to Marcus's chair. The fog continued to swirl, but within its embrace, Marcus felt something he'd thought lost forever: certainty. Not the desperate hypervigilance that had driven him since his injury, but the calm confidence of a soldier who finally understood his mission. "Why me?" he asked. "Why not someone who can walk, someone who—" "Because you know what it means to fail, Captain. You know the weight of guilt, the price of survival. And because," the voice gentled, "you're the only one left who might believe." Marcus stared at the bench, at Zeus's unwavering attention, at the impossible situation that was about to redefine his entire world. He could still choose safety, roll back to the security office, accept medical retirement, let someone else carry this burden. Instead, he reached for his radio and deliberately switched it off. "Tell me everything." The fog seemed to pulse around them as Charlotte's presence strengthened, and Marcus felt the temperature drop several degrees. Zeus remained pressed against his wheelchair, the dog's breathing steady and alert, as if he understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "The Ashworth family has been planning this for generations," Charlotte's voice continued, clearer now, carrying the weight of 2 centuries of observation. "They believe the monarchy should serve their vision of England, one where power flows through bloodlines they control, where the crown becomes a puppet for their ambitions." "How?" Marcus asked, his strategic mind already working through possibilities. "What's their plan for the coronation? They've positioned people throughout the royal household. Thomas Ashworth in the ceremonial planning office, yes, but also Margaret Ashworth Pemberton in the treasury, David Ashworth in the Archbishop's staff. They've married into other families, changed names, but kept their purpose. They mean to eliminate the direct line of succession during the ceremony itself." Marcus's blood chilled. "The king? The prince? All of them. They have someone inside your security team, Captain, someone who will ensure the protection fails when it matters most." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His team, people he'd vetted personally, trusted with his life and the lives of the royal family. But Charlotte was right about one thing. The coronation presented the perfect opportunity for a catastrophic security breach. Every member of the royal family would be in one location, following a precise, publicly known schedule. "Who?" he demanded. "Which one of my people?" "I cannot see that clearly. The living world is difficult for me to perceive in detail. But someone close to you, someone with access to the highest levels of planning." Marcus ran through the faces of his senior staff, Mills, Davis, Colonel Whitmore, Dr. Richardson. People who'd been with the security team for years, who'd undergone extensive background checks. The thought that one of them could be compromised made his stomach clench. "Why should I trust you?" he asked suddenly. "How do I know this isn't just my mind breaking down, creating elaborate conspiracy theories to avoid dealing with my own trauma?" The silence stretched for long moments before Charlotte responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of gentle humor. "Because, Captain, your mind, brilliant as it is, could never have conceived of what I'm about to show you." The fog around the bench began to swirl in patterns that defied the wind, forming shapes and images that flickered like old film. Marcus saw flashes of scenes, a young woman in Regency dress arguing with stern-faced men in a paneled room, papers being signed by candlelight, a figure in dark clothing approaching the bench where Charlotte sat alone, grieving. But more disturbing were the modern images that followed. Thomas Ashworth meeting with shadowy figures in anonymous conference rooms, documents being passed between hands, blueprints of Westminster Abbey with specific points marked in red ink. "They plan to use the ceremony itself as cover," Charlotte explained as the images faded. "Something that will look like a terrorist attack, but will be precisely orchestrated to eliminate specific targets while leaving their preferred succession intact." "The Duke of Marlborough," Marcus whispered, understanding flooding through him. "He's 15th in line, but if the direct succession is eliminated..." The Ashworths have been cultivating his family for decades. He would be a grateful puppet king, easily controlled by those who saved the monarchy from chaos. Zeus suddenly lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the castle entrance. A moment later, Marcus heard footsteps approaching through the fog, multiple sets, moving with purpose. His radio might be switched off, but someone had noticed his absence. "Captain Thorne?" Mills's voice called out. Tension evident even from a distance. "Sir, we need you back at the station immediately." Marcus looked at the bench where Charlotte's presence lingered, feeling the weight of impossible knowledge settling on his shoulders. He had perhaps 30 seconds before his team reached the courtyard, 30 seconds to decide whether to embrace madness or return to the illusion of sanity. "I cannot speak to you again soon." Charlotte's voice was fading now, becoming whisper-thin. "This contact drains me terribly. You must trust your instincts, Captain. Look for the patterns, financial records, family connections, anything that links back to 1817. And watch Colonel Whitmore carefully." Whitmore? Marcus's deputy, the man he'd trusted to handle security in his absence. Why Whitmore? But Charlotte's presence was already dissolving, leaving only the cold fog and Zeus's warm bulk against his chair. The German shepherd looked up at him with intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "You're not crazy, but you're also not safe." "Over here," Mills called out, closer now. "I can see his chair." Marcus reached down to scratch Zeus behind the ears, drawing comfort from the dog's solid reality. Whatever was happening to him, whatever impossible alliance he'd just formed with a long-dead princess, one thing was certain. The coronation was 3 weeks away, and somewhere in his inner circle a traitor was preparing to make history bleed. He switched his radio back on just as Mills emerged from the fog, her face tight with worry. "Sorry," he said, forcing his voice to sound normal. "Zeus led me on quite a chase." Mills's expression remained tense as she approached, a hand resting unconsciously on her radio. Behind her, Marcus could make out the silhouettes of 2 other security personnel emerging from the fog, Davis and someone else he couldn't identify in the murky darkness. "Sir, with respect, you've been out of contact for over 40 minutes, Mills said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying not to sound accusatory. "Dr. Richardson was concerned when you left the office so abruptly." Marcus felt Zeus shift against his wheelchair, the dog's massive frame still radiating alertness despite the outward calm. The German shepherd's behavior struck him as oddly protective, as if the animal sensed the precarious nature of this moment. "I needed to check on Zeus personally," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "When a security dog breaks containment, it requires immediate attention from senior staff." "Of course, sir." But Mills's eyes were scanning the courtyard, taking in the fog-shrouded bench, Zeus's unusually calm demeanor, the way Marcus's wheelchair was positioned, as if he'd been having a conversation with empty air. "Did you find anything unusual?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Marcus couldn't fully pass. Was she asking as his concerned lieutenant, or was there something more calculated behind her inquiry? Charlotte's warning about someone inside his team echoed in his mind, making every familiar face suddenly suspect. "Nothing beyond the obvious," he said carefully. Zeus was drawn to this area, but that's not uncommon. Dogs often return to places where they've encountered interesting scents. Davis stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the fog. "Sir, Colonel Whitmore has called an emergency briefing for 0800 tomorrow. Something about updated threat assessments for the coronation." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "He specifically requested that you review the personnel files tonight." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Personnel files, the perfect excuse to access information about his team members, to identify potential security vulnerabilities, or to determine who might be getting too close to uncomfortable truths. "Did he say what prompted this review?" Marcus asked. "Intelligence reports, according to him. Possible extremist chatter related to the ceremony." Davis's expression was unreadable in the fog. "He wants all senior staff to verify their clearance levels and confirm their assignments." Zeus suddenly stood, his attention shifting from the bench to the men surrounding Marcus's wheelchair. The dog's stance wasn't aggressive, but there was a subtle tension in his posture that Marcus recognized from years of working with security animals. Zeus was assessing threats, calculating distances, positioning himself strategically. "I'll review the files," Marcus said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "But first, I want all three of you to do something for me." Mills exchanged glances with Davis. "Sir? I want you to think carefully about any unusual requests you've received in the past month. Anyone asking questions about protocols, schedules, personnel assignments, anything that might have seemed routine at the time but feels odd in retrospect." The silence that followed was thick with more than fog. Marcus watched their faces, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that might reveal guilt or fear. But the darkness and mist made it impossible to read them clearly, and he realized how vulnerable his position truly was. Alone in this courtyard with three subordinates, at least one of whom might be compromised. "Sir," Mills said slowly, "is there something specific we should be concerned about?" Before Marcus could respond, Zeus moved, not aggressively, but with deliberate purpose. The German shepherd padded to each of the three security officers in turn, his nose working, his body language alert but non-threatening. When he reached Mills, he paused for a long moment, then continued to Davis. But when he approached the third figure, someone Marcus now recognized as Sergeant Fleming from the night shift, Zeus went completely still. The dog's hackles didn't rise, but something in his posture changed. A subtle shift that spoke of recognition, but not necessarily trust. Fleming cleared his throat. "Dog doesn't seem to like me much." "Zeus is particular about who he accepts," Marcus said, filing away the interaction for later analysis. "Some people just don't register as friendly to him." But even as he said it, Marcus remembered how immediately Zeus had accepted Charlotte's presence, how the aggressive animal had become calm and protective. If the dog could sense something beyond normal human perception, what was he detecting now? "We should head back," Mills suggested. "It's past midnight, and you have that early briefing with Colonel Whitmore." Marcus nodded, but as he began to wheel toward the castle entrance, he felt the weight of Charlotte's warnings settling on his shoulders like armor. 3 weeks until the coronation. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, plans were already in motion, plans that reached back 2 centuries and forward to a moment that would reshape the monarchy forever. He had until tomorrow's briefing to decide who he could trust with the impossible truth he'd learned tonight. Behind them, the fog swirled around the empty bench, keeping its secrets. The next morning arrived with brutal clarity. Marcus had spent the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn reviewing personnel files in his office, searching for patterns that might validate Charlotte's impossible warnings. What he found chilled him more than any phantom conversation could have. Thomas Ashworth's file was pristine, too pristine. His background checks were flawless, his references impeccable, his progression through the civil service unremarkable yet efficient. But buried in the administrative notes, Marcus found a detail that made his blood freeze. Ashworth had specifically requested assignment to coronation planning 3 months before the king's announcement. He'd positioned himself for this moment years in advance. More disturbing still were the subtle connections Marcus began to trace through other files. Fleming's emergency contact was listed as his cousin, Margaret Ashworth Pemberton. Davis had received a commendation letter from an archbishop's aide named David Ashworth. The web Charlotte had described wasn't theoretical, it was documented in their own security records, hiding in plain sight. Now Marcus sat across from Colonel Whitmore in the secure briefing room, watching his deputy's weathered face as he outlined the supposed new intelligence. The morning light streaming through bulletproof windows revealed details Marcus had somehow missed before. The way Whitmore's eyes didn't quite meet his when discussing personnel assignments, the slight tremor in his hands when he mentioned the coronation timeline. "The chatter we've intercepted suggests a coordinated attack," Whitmore was saying, his voice carrying the gravitas of 30 years in royal security. "Multiple entry points, sophisticated planning, We need to restructure our entire approach." "What kind of restructuring?" Marcus asked, his fingers gripping his wheelchair arms tighter than necessary. The phantom pain in his legs had returned with a vengeance, as if his body was preparing for battle. "Compartmentalization. Smaller teams with limited access to overall strategy. You'd handle perimeter security while I coordinate the inner circle protection directly." Marcus felt the trap closing around him. Whitmore was systematically isolating him from the core security planning, positioning himself to control every detail of the coronation's protective measures. It was brilliantly executed. Who would question a decorated colonel taking charge during a heightened threat? "Who identified this intelligence?" Marcus pressed. "Multiple sources. Thomas Ashworth flagged some unusual communications patterns in the ceremonial planning office. Davis noticed irregularities in the background checks. Even young Fleming picked up on suspicious behavior during night patrols." The names hit Marcus like physical blows. Everyone Charlotte had warned him about was now actively feeding information to Whitmore, creating a perfect justification for the security changes that would enable their attack. They weren't just planning to strike during the coronation. They were engineering the conditions that would guarantee their success. "I want to see the raw intelligence reports," Marcus said. Whitmore's pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Security classification prevents that, I'm afraid. Higher than your current clearance level." "My clearance level?" Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I'm head of palace security." "You're on modified duty status due to your injury, Marcus. Surely you remember signing those documents?" Whitmore's tone grew gentler, more patronizing. "Dr. Richardson has expressed concerns about your stress levels, your ability to handle the full responsibilities of your position." The revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow. While he'd been fighting to maintain his relevance, his authority had been quietly eroded through bureaucratic maneuvering. His injury hadn't just cost him his legs, it had made him vulnerable to exactly this kind of systematic undermining. "When was I classified as modified duty?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. 3 months ago, right after your last psychological evaluation. You seemed distracted during the session. Dr. Richardson felt it was a necessary precaution. 3 months. The same time frame when Thomas Ashworth had requested coronation assignment. Marcus realized with growing horror that his isolation hadn't been accidental. It had been orchestrated. Every doubt about his mental state, every concern about his fitness for duty had been carefully cultivated to remove him as an obstacle. His radio crackled to life. "All senior staff to the courtyard immediately. Code yellow." Whitmore's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught the micro-flash of satisfaction in his eyes. "What's code yellow?" Marcus demanded, his mind racing through every security protocol he'd established. "Emergency evacuation drill. Standard procedure for coronation preparation." Whitmore was already standing, moving toward the door with practiced efficiency. "Though given your modified status, perhaps you should remain here while the active duty personnel handle—" "No." Marcus's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect long before his injury. "I'm still head of palace security, Colonel. Modified duty or not." As he wheeled toward the courtyard, Marcus felt the weight of Charlotte's warning settling around him like armor. Everything she'd predicted was coming to pass. The isolation, the manipulation, the careful positioning of pieces on a board. He was only now beginning to see clearly. The ordeal had begun, and Marcus Thorne was about to discover just how far his enemies were willing to go to eliminate the last obstacle standing between them and the crown. The dark moment. The courtyard erupted into chaos the moment Marcus arrived. What Whitmore had called a standard evacuation drill was anything but standard. Vehicles surrounded the perimeter. Armed personnel moved with military precision, and at the center of it all stood Thomas Ashworth with a clipboard, directing operations like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Marcus's wheelchair jerked to a halt as the scope of what he was witnessing became clear. This wasn't a drill. This was a coup disguised as security preparation. "Captain Thorne," Ashworth called out with mock cheerfulness, approaching through the organized mayhem. Perfect timing. We were just implementing the new protocols Colonel Whitmore briefed you on. Around them, Marcus watched his carefully constructed security network being systematically dismantled. Personnel he'd trained, procedures he'd written, safeguards he'd spent 3 years perfecting, all of it being reorganized under the guise of enhanced coronation security. Mills stood near the main entrance, her face carefully neutral as she supervised the removal of communication equipment. Davis was directing unfamiliar faces in the installation of new surveillance systems. Even Fleming was there, conspicuously avoiding eye contact as he handed over access codes to men Marcus had never seen before. Who authorized this overhaul? Marcus demanded, but even as he spoke, he knew the answer would crush him. Ashworth consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. Emergency Powers Provision, Section 12. In cases where the head of security is deemed temporarily incapacitated, operational authority transfers to the deputy commander. He looked up with sympathetic eyes that didn't match the satisfaction in his voice. Colonel Whitmore felt it was necessary, given your recent episodes. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. They'd weaponized his conversation with Charlotte, turned his moment of supernatural revelation into evidence of mental breakdown. Every person in this courtyard now looked at him not as their commanding officer, but as a damaged veteran whose grip on reality had finally snapped. "I want to see the documentation," Marcus said, forcing his voice to remain steady even as his world crumbled around him. Of course. Ashworth produced a tablet, swiping to a medical report that made Marcus's blood freeze. Dr. Richardson's signature was prominently displayed, but the assessment described behavior Marcus didn't yet remember exhibiting: paranoid delusions, aggressive outbursts, conversations with imaginary contacts. The psychological evaluation was quite thorough. Dr. Richardson was particularly concerned about your claim to have supernatural sources providing intelligence about historical conspiracies. Marcus stared at the screen, realizing the devastating precision of their trap. They'd turned his greatest discovery into his ultimate downfall. Charlotte's warnings, Zeus's strange behavior, the 2-century conspiracy, all of it now existed in his official record as evidence of PTSD-induced psychosis. "This is fabricated," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "Captain," Mills approached, her expression pained. "Sir, we're all concerned about you, the stress of the coronation, your injury, the responsibility you've been carrying." She gestured helplessly. "Maybe some time away would help." The betrayal hit harder than any physical wound. Mills, whom he'd mentored, trusted, relied upon. She was looking at him with the careful sympathy reserved for broken things that needed gentle handling. Worse, her concern appeared genuine. They'd convinced her, convinced all of them, that removing him was an act of compassion rather than conspiracy. Zeus suddenly appeared at Marcus's side, the German shepherd emerging from whatever kennels they'd moved him to. But something was wrong. The dog's movements were sluggish, his usually alert eyes glazed and unfocused. When Marcus reached down to touch him, Zeus barely responded. "What did you do to him?" Marcus asked, a cold fury building in his chest. "Mild sedatives," Ashworth replied casually. "The veterinarian felt Zeus had become too emotionally attached to you, affecting his ability to work with other handlers." He paused meaningfully. "Dogs can develop psychological disorders too, Captain. Sometimes they pick up their handlers' instabilities. They'd stolen everything: his authority, his team's trust, his reputation, and now even Zeus. The one witness to Charlotte's manifestation, the only being who could validate his sanity." Marcus watched his loyal companion struggle to stay alert and felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with phantom pain. "The coronation," he began. "Will proceed with enhanced security," Whitmore interrupted, appearing at Ashworth's shoulder like a vulture. "Thomas has identified several potential vulnerabilities in your original planning. We'll have them addressed well before the ceremony." Marcus understood now. They weren't just removing him from the equation, they were positioning themselves as the heroes who'd identified the flaws in his work. When their attack succeeded, the narrative would write itself, the disabled veteran whose mental breakdown had left the monarchy vulnerable, and the dedicated professionals who'd tried to compensate for his failures. As they wheeled him away from the courtyard, away from his life's work, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the stone bench where Charlotte had appeared. It sat empty and silent in the morning light, offering no supernatural salvation, no ghostly intervention. He was utterly, devastatingly alone. The corridor to his quarters felt endless, each turn of his wheelchair wheels echoing like a funeral march through the stone halls. Marcus had travelled this path thousands of times, but now it felt foreign, as if the very walls had turned against him. Behind him, he could hear the distant sounds of his security apparatus being dismantled, his life's work erased with bureaucratic efficiency. They deposited him at his door like damaged cargo, Whitmore offering platitudes about rest and recovery, while Ashworth's eyes gleamed with barely concealed triumph. Marcus waited until their footsteps faded before wheeling himself inside, closing the door with trembling hands that betrayed none of the rage building in his chest. The silence of his quarters was deafening. For 3 years, this space had been his sanctuary, filled with the constant hum of security monitors, radio chatter, the organized chaos of protecting the crown. Now the screens were dark, the radios silent. They'd even taken his access codes. Marcus positioned himself before his personal computer, the one device they hadn't yet confiscated, and began typing with desperate precision. If they'd fabricated his psychological evaluation, there would be traces, digital fingerprints in the medical database, timestamp inconsistencies, electronic breadcrumbs that could expose their conspiracy. What he found was worse than fabrication. It was truth, twisted beyond recognition. Every conversation he'd had with Dr. Richardson was accurately documented, but the context had been surgically removed. His mention of historical patterns became paranoid fixation on past events. His reference to unusual intelligence sources transformed into claims of supernatural contact. His entirely reasonable concerns about Thomas Ashworth were recorded as unfounded suspicions of colleagues. They hadn't lied. They'd simply reframed his sanity as madness, his insights as delusions, his duty as obsession. Marcus scrolled deeper, accessing archived files through emergency protocols he'd hoped never to use. Personnel records, financial transactions, communication logs, all the digital detritus of palace life that most people forgot existed. If Charlotte was right about the bloodline conspiracy, if Ashworth truly represented a 2-century vendetta, there would be evidence buried somewhere in this electronic maze. Hours passed. His phantom pain flared and subsided, ignored in favor of the greater agony of systematic betrayal. The afternoon light streaming through his window gradually dimmed as Marcus traced connections that painted an increasingly horrifying picture. Ashworth's family tree revealed the truth Charlotte had died trying to expose. The Ashworth Pembertons weren't merely old money, they were the descendants of Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the man who had orchestrated Princess Charlotte's murder in 1817. For 2 centuries they'd maintained positions of influence, waiting for the perfect moment to complete what their ancestor had started. The coronation represented that moment. With the king's line ended, distant cousins would ascend, cousins whose genealogy connected them directly to the Ashworth family. Marcus stared at the family chart spreading across his screen like a spider's web, realizing he was looking at the blueprint for the constitutional monarchy's transformation into something far more sinister. But it was the final discovery that shattered everything he thought he knew about himself, his injury, his purpose. Deep in the classified files from the terrorist attack 3 years ago, Marcus found records that had been sealed above his clearance level. The attack that had taken his legs, killed 12 of his men, and nearly destroyed the royal family. It hadn't been random extremist violence. Thomas Ashworth's signature appeared on intelligence briefings 3 weeks before the attack. Warnings about increased chatter, recommendations for security adjustments, personnel reassignments that had placed Marcus in exactly the position where the bomb would detonate. The same methodical planning now being employed for the coronation had been tested 3 years ago, with Marcus as the unwitting subject. They'd needed him injured, not dead, wounded enough to be sympathetic but not eliminated entirely. His survival had been calculated, his recovery managed, his rehabilitation guided, all to position him as the perfect scapegoat for their final gambit. The disabled hero whose tragic breakdown would explain away their greatest triumph. Marcus's hands shook as he absorbed the magnitude of his manipulation. Every conversation with Dr. Richardson, every doubt about his capabilities, every moment of phantom pain, all of it had been orchestrated by people who saw him not as a person, but as a chess piece to be sacrificed when the game reached its climax. The revelation broke something fundamental inside him, but instead of despair, Marcus felt a cold clarity descending like armor. They'd made one crucial mistake in their decades of planning. They'd assumed that destroying his body would eventually destroy his spirit. Charlotte had appeared to him not because of PTSD hallucinations, but because the dead recognized something in him that his enemies couldn't see. She'd chosen him not despite his brokenness, but because of what he'd become through it. A man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous opponent of all. Rising from his computer, Marcus began to plan his counterattack. The first thing Marcus needed was an ally who existed outside their web of influence. Someone they hadn't anticipated, couldn't control, and wouldn't expect him to contact. He wheeled to his secure phone, the personal line they hadn't yet discovered, and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. Sergeant Major Patricia Sinclair, retired, came the crisp voice on the third ring. "Patsy, it's Marcus Thorne." The pause stretched for several heartbeats. "Christ, Marcus, haven't heard from you since the memorial service. How are you holding up?" Patricia Sinclair had been his mentor 20 years ago, a woman who'd broken through every barrier the military could construct with nothing but competence and unshakable integrity. She'd retired from active duty the year before his injury, disgusted with the political games that had begun infecting even the Royal Guard. If anyone would listen to what sounded like an impossible conspiracy, it would be the woman who'd taught him to trust evidence over appearances. "I need your help, Patsy, and you're going to think I've lost my mind. Try me." Marcus laid out everything. Charlotte's appearance, the conspiracy spanning 2 centuries, his systematic isolation and manipulation. He expected skepticism, questions about his mental state, the same patronizing concern he'd seen in Mills's eyes. Instead, Patricia listened in thoughtful silence. "You know," she said finally, "I always wondered about Ashworth's rapid advancement. Boy went from lieutenant to deputy commander faster than anyone I'd seen, and his personnel file was curiously light on details before 2018. You knew him?" "Served with his father briefly in the 80s. Edmund Ashworth, charming man, but there was something calculating about him. Always asking questions about palace protocols, royal genealogy, things that seemed academic rather than operational." Her voice hardened. "I ran an unofficial background check after young Thomas got his promotion. The family has more money than their recorded professions should generate, and their influence extends into circles that should be completely separate from military service." Marcus felt the first spark of hope in hours. "Can you access personnel files you couldn't before? Things above my clearance?" "Retirement has its advantages. Old contacts, favors owed, systems that remember my authorization codes even when they shouldn't." Patricia paused. "Give me 2 hours. If there's evidence of what you're describing, I'll find it." While Patricia worked her connections, Marcus turned his attention to the palace's physical vulnerabilities. They'd removed him from active planning, but they couldn't erase 3 years of intimate knowledge about Windsor's defenses. Every hidden passage, every emergency protocol, every backup system, it was all encoded in his memory. Zeus appeared at his door, the German shepherd moving with more clarity than he'd shown in the courtyard. The sedatives were wearing off, and with their diminishment came the dog's natural intelligence. Marcus knelt from his wheelchair, examining Zeus's eyes, still clouded but alert enough to be useful. They made a mistake with you too, didn't they? Marcus murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Thought a little chemical compliance would solve their problem. Zeus pressed against him, the contact triggering a memory that made Marcus's breath catch. Charlotte had said the dead recognized something in him, but perhaps it was simpler than supernatural intervention. Perhaps Zeus had reacted to his conversation with the princess because the dog sensed what Marcus was only now understanding, that the enemy they faced wasn't entirely human in its calculation. 2 centuries of planning required a dedication that transcended individual lifespans. The Ashworth Pembertons hadn't just inherited wealth and influence, they'd inherited purpose. Each generation raised to continue a mission that demanded sacrificing everything, including their own humanity, to achieve ultimate power. His phone buzzed, a text from Patricia containing only coordinates and a time. She'd found something. Marcus spent the next hour planning his movement through the palace. His wheelchair access had been revoked for most areas, but the designers hadn't considered that the man who'd overseen the modifications would remember alternate routes. Service elevators, maintenance corridors, forgotten passages from Windsor's medieval origins, pathways that existed below the level of modern security systems. As evening approached, Marcus made his most crucial decision. They expected him to be broken, isolated, helpless. They'd constructed their trap around the assumption that destroying his official authority would neutralize the threat he represented. But authority had never been his true strength. For 3 years, he'd fought to prove he was still the man he'd been before the bombing. Tonight, he would become something else entirely, something they hadn't planned for and couldn't control. Not the decorated captain clinging to past glory, but a weapon forged in betrayal and tempered by purpose. Marcus gathered what he needed: emergency communication equipment, building schematics, Zeus's leash, and the ceremonial sidearm they'd forgotten to confiscate. Rising from his computer, he felt Charlotte's presence not as supernatural visitation, but as inherited duty. The dead princess had chosen her champion well. Now it was time to prove worthy of that choice. The service elevator descended through Windsor's forgotten arteries like a steel coffin, carrying Marcus deeper into the castle's medieval bones where modern surveillance couldn't penetrate. Zeus pressed against his wheelchair, the sedatives finally clearing enough for the dog's natural alertness to return. Each floor they passed represented another layer of deception Marcus had lived under. The ground level where they'd stripped his authority, the administrative floors where they'd fabricated his psychological collapse, the executive suites where Ashworth had orchestrated 3 years of manipulation. The coordinates Patricia had sent led to the castle's original wine cellars, now converted into archival storage that most staff had forgotten existed. Marcus navigated the narrow corridors with practiced efficiency, his wheelchair modified with all-terrain capabilities he'd never expected to use for clandestine operations. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd given him tools for independence that would now serve his rebellion. Patricia emerged from the shadows like a spectre of his former life. Her grey hair pulled into the same severe bun she'd worn during active duty 20 years ago. At 68, she moved with the fluid precision of a woman who'd never allowed retirement to soften her edges. Her eyes, sharp as surgical steel, assessed Marcus with the frank evaluation of a commanding officer rather than the pitying sympathy he'd endured all day. "You look like hell," she said without preamble, "but your intel was solid. Ashworth's entire family tree is built on fabrications and strategic marriages designed to position them for exactly what you've described." She handed him a tablet, displaying genealogical charts that painted the Ashworth Pembertons not as old money, but as patient predators. Each generation had produced children who entered military service, government positions, or financial institutions, never rising high enough to attract attention, but always positioned to influence critical decisions. The pattern stretched back to 1817, with Lord Chancellor Pemberton's bastard son taking the Ashworth name and beginning a dynasty of calculated revenge. "The coronation isn't their endgame," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent reading between bureaucratic lines. It's their catalyst. They've been buying influence in Parliament, placing allies in key positions throughout the Commonwealth, positioning themselves to control the constitutional crisis that will follow the King's death. Marcus studied the documents, feeling pieces of a centuries-old puzzle clicking into place. They need legitimacy, something that makes their ascension appear constitutional rather than treasonous. Exactly. And they need a scapegoat whose failure explains how such a well-protected monarchy could fall. Patricia's expression darkened. Your psychological breakdown provides perfect cover. The disabled veteran whose PTSD-induced paranoia left the crown vulnerable to attack. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but instead of breaking him, they crystallized his resolve. Every moment of phantom pain, every doubt about his capabilities, every carefully managed conversation with Dr. Richardson, all of it designed to create the narrative they needed. He'd been groomed for failure so expertly that he'd nearly convinced himself of his own inadequacy. There's more, Patricia said, producing a second tablet. I traced the financial backing for the terrorist attack 3 years ago. The money came through shell companies, but the ultimate source leads back to Ashworth family trusts. They funded the operation that took your legs. Marcus stared at the screen, watching his entire understanding of himself disintegrate and reform. The bombing hadn't been random terrorism. It had been a recruitment operation. They'd needed him wounded, traumatized, grateful for any chance to continue serving. Every day of his recovery, every modification to his quarters, every accommodation for his disability had been calculated to make him dependent on their version of mercy. Zeus suddenly tensed, his ears pricking toward the corridor they'd just traveled. Footsteps echoed from the direction of the elevator, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Ashworth's people had discovered their breach faster than Marcus had anticipated. They're tracking us, he whispered. But Patricia was already moving, gathering the tablets and activating what looked like a sophisticated jamming device. Not us, she replied grimly. They're tracking you. The wheelchair. It's been broadcasting your location since they modified it 3 years ago. Every moment of independence they gave you came with electronic leashes. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else he'd endured. Even his mobility, his hard-won autonomy, had been an illusion designed to make him compliant. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, not the desperate hope of a man trying to reclaim his old life, but the cold calculation of someone who'd finally stopped fighting the reality of what he'd become. The coronation is in 4 days, he said, his voice carrying new authority. We need to expose them before they can execute their final phase. Patricia nodded, leading him toward a passage that would take them deeper into the castle's forgotten spaces. Then we stop fighting their game and start playing our own. They wanted to create a broken veteran consumed by paranoid delusions? She glanced back with a predator's smile. Let's give them exactly what they asked for. Marcus followed her into the darkness, finally understanding that his true strength had never been his ability to walk. The passage Patricia led him through hadn't been used since the Second World War, when Windsor's deepest chambers had served as bomb shelters for the royal family. The walls still bore chalk markings from air raid protocols, ghostly reminders that the crown had weathered existential threats before. Marcus's wheelchair moved silently over stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of use, Zeus padding beside him with predatory alertness. They emerged into what had once been the castle's medieval armory, now a forgotten vault filled with abandoned furniture and obsolete security equipment. Patricia sealed the entrance behind them using an electronic lock Marcus didn't recognize. Military hardware that suggested her retirement hadn't completely severed her connections to operational networks. 3 days until the coronation, she said, activating a portable communications array that transformed the dusty chamber into a field command center. Ashworth's timeline accelerates now. They can't risk you recovering your credibility or finding allies who might listen. Marcus positioned himself at the makeshift intelligence station, finally feeling the familiar weight of operational command settling around his shoulders like an old uniform. Every skill they'd trained into him over 3 decades of service, tactical analysis, strategic planning, threat assessment, crystallized into sharp focus. The phantom pain that had plagued him for years receded, replaced by the cold clarity of purpose. "They'll move against me tonight," he said, studying the castle's schematics Patricia had uploaded. "Public breakdown, emergency psychiatric hold, complete isolation until after the coronation. Classic neutralization protocol." Zeus suddenly raised his head, ears swiveling towards sounds Marcus couldn't detect. The dog's behavior had been erratic since their encounter with Charlotte, but now his alertness carried the focused intensity Marcus remembered from their first meeting in the courtyard. Whatever sedatives they'd used were wearing off, revealing the sharp intelligence beneath. "The dog knows," Patricia observed, watching Zeus position himself between Marcus and the sealed entrance. "Animals sense things we miss. Chemical changes, electromagnetic signatures, behavioral patterns our conscious minds dismiss." Marcus reached down to touch Zeus's head, feeling the coiled tension in the animal's muscles. Charlotte had appeared when the dog was present, and Zeus had responded to her presence with recognition rather than fear. Not supernatural intervention, but simple animal awareness of what humans had trained themselves to ignore. They made Zeus part of the deception too, Marcus realized. Controlled his behavior, managed his responses, used him to validate my supposed psychological deterioration. The communications array crackled to life, Patricia's fingers dancing across controls with muscle memory that belied her retirement. Encrypted channels opened, revealing a network Marcus hadn't known existed. Former military personnel, intelligence operatives, palace staff who'd maintained loyalty to principles rather than personalities. "Your reputation preceded you," Patricia explained as coded confirmations flooded the screen. "Half the Royal Guard has questioned Ashworth's rapid promotion. Military intelligence has noticed gaps in his operational history. Even the household staff think his security modifications are excessive." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the solidarity of competent people working toward a common goal. They'd isolated him so thoroughly that he'd forgotten what professional respect felt like, how it differed from the patronizing sympathy that had become his daily bread. "We need evidence that can't be dismissed as delusion," he said, his tactical mind engaging with problems that had solutions rather than symptoms that required management. Financial records, communications, proof of the genealogical manipulation. Patricia produced another device, a sophisticated hacking tool that would have impressed Marcus even during his active duty years. The beauty of their 2-century timeline is that it required documentation. Birth certificates, marriage records, property transfers, all the legal breadcrumbs they thought were safely buried in archives. As she worked, Marcus studied the castle's defensive systems from an entirely new perspective. For 3 years, he'd analyzed Windsor's vulnerabilities thinking like a protector. Now he considered them through the eyes of someone who understood that the greatest threat came from within. Ashworth hadn't modified security to strengthen royal protection. He'd created controlled weaknesses that could be exploited when the moment came. The realization crystallized Marcus's understanding of his true role in their conspiracy. They didn't just need a scapegoat for their success. They needed someone whose failure would justify the systematic changes they'd already implemented. His supposed psychological breakdown would explain why security protocols had been altered, why traditional safeguards had been modified, why the constitutional monarchy had become vulnerable to the very attacks they were planning. Zeus suddenly stood, every muscle tense, as footsteps echoed through passages Marcus thought were sealed, multiple sets moving with coordination that spoke of military training. Ashworth's people had found them faster than anticipated, which meant the electronic leashes Patricia had described extended beyond his wheelchair. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. Patricia's fingers flew over her equipment, initiating protocols that would scatter their evidence across secure networks even if they were captured. "Long enough to give them exactly what they asked for," she replied with a predator's smile. "They wanted a broken veteran consumed by paranoid delusions. Time to show them what that actually looks like." The chamber erupted into chaos as the first explosive charge shattered the sealed entrance. Marcus had miscalculated. Ashworth hadn't sent security personnel or even palace guards. Through the smoke and debris came figures in tactical gear, moving with the precision of special operations, their faces hidden behind night vision equipment that gave them the appearance of mechanical predators. "Down!" Patricia shouted, but Marcus was already moving, his wheelchair spinning toward cover behind an overturned cabinet. Zeus launched himself at the lead figure with 3 years of suppressed aggression finally unleashed, his powerful jaws finding purchase on Kevlar that couldn't protect against 100 pounds of furious German shepherd. The tactical advantage belonged to Ashworth's team: superior firepower, advanced equipment, control of the only exit. But Marcus had spent 3 decades turning disadvantages into weapons. His wheelchair wasn't just mobility equipment. The all-terrain modifications included reinforced titanium framework that could absorb impacts and pneumatic systems that provided unexpected maneuverability. "Marcus Thorne!" Ashworth's voice echoed through the chamber as he stepped through the breach, no longer maintaining the pretense of concerned colleague. Gone was the sympathetic administrator who'd managed Marcus's decline. In his place stood something colder, more calculating. 3 years of careful planning, and you had to develop a conscience. Marcus emerged from cover, his wheelchair positioned to use the chamber's medieval architecture to his advantage. Stone pillars provided protection while limiting their fields of fire, forcing Ashworth's people into closer quarters where their superior numbers meant less. Zeus had disabled one operative and now circled the others with predatory intelligence, no longer the sedated, confused animal they'd controlled. "Lord Chancellor Pemberton would be proud," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the chamber with parade ground authority. 200 years of patience finally paying off. "Tell me, was murdering Princess Charlotte always part of the family tradition, or did that innovation come later?" Ashworth's composure cracked, revealing something Marcus recognized from his years studying terrorist psychology: the fervent certainty of someone who'd convinced themselves that any action was justified by their ultimate goal. Charlotte was weak, just like the current monarchy. Constitutional democracy is a failed experiment that requires correction. The admission sent adrenaline surging through Marcus's system, not the panic-inducing chemical flood he'd experienced during his worst episodes, but the sharp focus of combat readiness. Every phantom pain, every moment of self-doubt, every carefully cultivated weakness fell away as his mind achieved the crystalline clarity he'd thought lost forever. Patricia had melted into the chamber's shadows, her communications equipment broadcasting their confrontation across encrypted networks that would ensure Ashworth's confession reached the right ears. But Marcus understood that evidence alone wouldn't stop what was coming. The coronation was 48 hours away, and Ashworth had spent 3 years positioning assets for an operation that required only his authorization to execute. "The bombing 3 years ago," Marcus said, maneuvering his wheelchair with tactical precision as Ashworth's operatives tried to flank his position. "You needed me broken, grateful, dependent. Every accommodation you provided came with strings attached." Zeus suddenly charged past Marcus, not attacking but responding to some signal only he could detect. The dog's behavior in the courtyard, that moment of supernatural awareness, hadn't been Charlotte's ghost but the animal's ability to sense electromagnetic signatures, chemical traces, behavioral patterns that revealed deception. Ashworth raised his sidearm with the fluid motion of someone comfortable with violence, but Marcus had already anticipated the movement. His wheelchair's pneumatic system engaged, lifting him above the expected firing angle, while his own weapon cleared its holster with muscle memory that 3 years of phantom pain couldn't erase. The shot echoed through the medieval chamber like thunder, but it wasn't Ashworth who fired first. Marcus's bullet found its mark with the precision of someone who'd qualified expert marksman for 15 consecutive years, striking Ashworth's weapon and sending it spinning into the darkness. "Dan down!" Marcus commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority as he covered Ashworth's remaining operatives. Zeus positioned himself between the wounded conspirators and their equipment, his military training finally free of chemical suppression. Patricia emerged from the shadows with her own weapon drawn, but more importantly, with confirmation that their evidence was already reaching Parliament, military intelligence, and loyal palace staff. "Checkmate," she said simply. Ashworth collapsed against the stone wall, blood seeping through his fingers where Marcus's shot had shattered his wrist. For the first time in 3 years, he looked at Marcus without condescension or manufactured sympathy, only the respect one predator accorded another. "You think this stops anything?" Ashworth gasped. 2 centuries of planning doesn't depend on one man. The coronation will proceed as scheduled, and when it does, "It will proceed," Marcus interrupted, "with security provided by people who understand that the Crown's greatest strength has always been its ability to adapt and survive." The phantom pain was gone, Marcus realized, not managed or medicated, but simply absent, replaced by the bone-deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. But even as the immediate threat neutralized, Marcus understood that victory demanded a price he hadn't yet calculated. Ashworth's remaining operatives were surrendering, their hands visible as Patricia's network closed in from the passages beyond. Yet the conspiracy's true scope became clear as emergency communications flooded Patricia's equipment. Ashworth had triggered dead man's switches across London. "Multiple breaches at Buckingham Palace," Patricia reported, her voice tight with professional concern. "Westminster Bridge, Parliament Square, the Abbey itself. He's activated sleeper cells positioned for the coronation." Marcus felt the tactical situation crystallizing with brutal clarity. Ashworth had engineered a distributed attack that could only be stopped by someone with comprehensive knowledge of royal security protocols, knowledge that existed in perhaps 3 minds in all of Britain. 2 of those minds belonged to conspirators, the third was his own. "The command center," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "I have to coordinate the response from Palace Security's nerve center. Real-time intelligence, direct communication with counter-terrorism units, override authority for all protective protocols." Zeus pressed against his wheelchair, the dog's newly cleared senses detecting the shift in Marcus's emotional state. The animal's loyalty had never wavered, even under chemical suppression, a constancy that made what Marcus had to do even more painful. "The moment I take operational command, I become the primary target," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd finally accepted an inevitable truth. "Every cell, every asset, every backup plan they've positioned will converge on eliminating the one person who can coordinate effective resistance." Patricia's expression revealed that she understood the tactical mathematics as clearly as he did. "Your wheelchair, the mobility systems they modified, contain tracking devices that can't be removed without specialized equipment we don't have. The moment you enter palace security, they'll know exactly where you are." Marcus reached down to touch Zeus's head, feeling the solid warmth of the only relationship in his life that hadn't been manipulated or managed. The dog's dark eyes held intelligence that transcended human duplicity, pure loyalty, uncomplicated by agenda. It was, Marcus realized, the closest thing to love he'd experienced since losing his legs. "Zeus can't come with me," he said, the words emerging with difficulty. "Palace security protocols won't permit animals in the command center during active operations, and if I'm killed—" He paused, understanding that his death was not a possibility but a probability. He'll need someone who understands what he's been through. The sacrifice revealed itself with mathematical precision. Not just his life, that had been forfeit the moment he'd chosen duty over safety 3 years ago, but his chance to heal the relationship that had given meaning to his recovery. Zeus had been his anchor through phantom pain and psychological isolation, the one constant in a world where every other connection had been systematically corrupted. Ashworth's laughter echoed through the chamber, weak but triumphant despite his capture. "You see it now, don't you? The beautiful irony. Save the monarchy and die forgotten. Run and watch constitutional democracy burn while you live with the knowledge that you could have prevented it." Marcus met the conspirator's eyes with the calm certainty of someone who'd found peace with an impossible choice. "You misunderstand what service means. It was never about survival or recognition. It was about being worthy of the trust placed in you." Patricia knelt beside his wheelchair, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd made similar calculations during her own operational career. "There might be another way, if we can trace their command structure." "There's no time," Marcus interrupted, checking his watch with movements that felt ritualistic. "Final. The coronation begins in 36 hours. Every minute we delay gives them more opportunity to position assets or activate contingencies." Zeus whined softly, animal instinct detecting the shift in Marcus's scent that accompanied resignation. The dog had been trained to provide emotional support, to anchor his handler during episodes of psychological distress. But this wasn't distress. It was acceptance of duty's ultimate requirement. Marcus removed Zeus's service collar, the weight of the leather and metal seeming enormous in his hands. For 3 years, that collar had symbolized his need for assistance, his dependence on accommodation. Now it represented something else entirely, proof that healing was possible, that purpose could survive any transformation. "Take care of him," he said, pressing the collar into Patricia's hands. "When this is over, whatever happens, make sure he understands he was the best partner I ever had." The tactical communications array crackled with updates from across London. Ashworth's cells moving into position, security forces struggling to coordinate response without central command authority. Every second of delay meant more lives at risk, more damage to institutions that had weathered centuries of threats. Marcus straightened his shoulders with movements that echoed his parade ground bearing from decades past. The phantom pain was truly gone now, replaced by the bone-deep certainty that came with understanding one's true purpose. "Zeus, stay," he commanded, using the tone that brooked no disobedience. Then Marcus Thorne, captain of the Royal Guard, wheeled toward his final mission. The Palace Security Command Center had never felt smaller. Banks of monitors displayed London's arteries like a patient's vital signs. Parliament Square sealed, Westminster Bridge evacuated, tactical units positioning around the Abbey. Marcus's fingers moved across controls that 3 years ago he'd believed he'd never touch again, each keystroke carrying the weight of lives hanging in balance. "Tango 7, redirect to the north entrance." He spoke into his headset, his voice carrying across encrypted channels with the authority of someone born for command. "Alpha units, maintain perimeter but watch for pedestrian approaches. They're using civilians as cover." The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years, Ashworth had systematically isolated him from operational responsibility, convincing him that his injuries made him unsuitable for active duty. Now Marcus commanded the largest counter-terrorism response in British history from a wheelchair, proving that competence had never required the ability to walk. Zeus's absence created an ache deeper than phantom pain had ever reached. The dog would have positioned himself beside the command chair, solid warmth and unwavering loyalty during the storm of coordinating dozens of teams across London. Instead, Marcus worked alone, his hands steady despite knowing that every transmission revealed his location to the very people he was hunting. "Sir, we have confirmation on the genealogical documentation," came Patricia's voice through the secure channel. She'd remained at Windsor, with Ashworth and his captured operatives, coordinating with authorities who finally understood the scope of what they'd uncovered. 200 years of marriage manipulation, property consolidation, political positioning. The evidence is irrefutable. Marcus allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Princess Charlotte's voice in the courtyard. Whether supernatural intervention or his subconscious mind processing clues his training had detected, had led them to proof that would reshape historical understanding. Her murder hadn't been an isolated crime, but the foundation stone of a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in toppling constitutional monarchy itself. Movement on Whitehall, reported one of his tactical units. 3 vehicles, moving in formation toward the palace gates. Marcus's training took over, analyzing approach vectors and deployment patterns with the clarity that came from decades of operational experience. Ashworth had been right about the mathematical precision of their trap. Every moment Marcus remained in command increased the probability of his elimination. But that same mathematics revealed their weakness. The conspiracy required his death to succeed, which meant they had to expose themselves to achieve it. "All units, convergence protocol," he commanded. "Let them come to us." The monitors showed Ashworth's people moving with desperate urgency now that their leader was captured and their timeline compressed. No more careful manipulation or patient positioning. They were committed to a frontal assault that would either eliminate Marcus or fail completely. His wheelchair's modified mobility systems hummed quietly as he positioned himself for what was coming. The very accommodations Ashworth had provided to track his movements now gave him advantages the conspirators hadn't anticipated. Reinforced framework that could absorb impacts, pneumatic systems that provided unexpected maneuverability, all-terrain capabilities that meant he could operate effectively even if the command center was compromised. "Sir," came another voice through his headset. "Confirmation from Buckingham Palace, all primary threats neutralized. Westminster Abbey reports clear. They're falling back to the palace as their final target." Marcus nodded, though no one could see the gesture. The psychological pressure was working exactly as intended. By eliminating their distributed threats, he'd forced them into the very mistake that would ensure their capture, concentrating their remaining assets for a single, desperate attempt at success. The first explosion shattered windows throughout the East Wing, close enough that Marcus felt the shockwave through his wheelchair's frame. Emergency lighting bathed the command center in red shadows as backup power systems engaged automatically. His monitors flickered but remained operational. The palace's security infrastructure had been designed to withstand much worse than what Ashworth's people could deliver. "Contact, main corridor," reported his closest protection team. "Multiple hostiles, military-grade equipment. They're pushing hard for your location." Marcus's hands never slowed across the controls, continuing to coordinate the broader response, even as violence approached his position. This was what Ashworth had never understood, that true leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond personal survival. The conspiracy could kill him, but they couldn't prevent the constitutional monarchy from surviving their assault. Zeus appeared in the command center's doorway like a ghost-given form, Patricia behind him with weapon drawn and tactical equipment slung across her shoulders. The dog had somehow tracked him, despite every protocol designed to keep animals away from operational centers during emergencies. "He wouldn't stay," Patricia explained simply, taking position to cover the entrance. "Military working dogs don't abandon their handlers." Marcus felt something profound settle into place as Zeus assumed his familiar position beside the wheelchair, not the desperate isolation he'd accepted as the price of duty, but the solidarity that came from partnership freely given and earned through shared purpose. The monitors showed the final assault wave approaching through corridors that Marcus had defended for 3 decades. This time he wouldn't be defending alone. "All units, final positions," he commanded. "Let's finish what Princess Charlotte started 200 years ago." The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Marcus counted each one as tactical teams swept through corridors where gunfire had echoed moments before. Then came the voices through his headset, crisp and professional. "Command, all hostiles neutralized, palace secure." Marcus leaned back in his wheelchair, his hands finally still on the controls that had coordinated the largest counter-terrorism operation in modern British history. Zeus remained at his side, the dog's presence no longer necessary for emotional support but chosen, a partnership between equals rather than accommodation for disability. Sir Patricia's voice carried exhaustion and something else, respect that hadn't been there when this began. Parliament's requesting immediate debrief. The Prime Minister wants confirmation that the coronation can proceed as scheduled. Marcus studied the monitors showing London returning to normalcy, traffic resuming across Westminster Bridge, tourists gathering again in Parliament Square, the rhythms of constitutional democracy continuing because people like them had chosen duty over safety. The phantom pain that had defined 3 years of his existence remained absent, replaced by certainty about who he'd become. "Tell them the coronation proceeds tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The crown has survived worse threats than this conspiracy. It will endure." Zeus stretched against his wheelchair, the gesture comfortable rather than urgent. The dog's chemical suppression was completely cleared now, revealing the intelligence and loyalty that 3 years of manipulation had hidden. Marcus reached down to scratch behind the German shepherd's ears, feeling gratitude for constancy that had anchored him through transformation he'd never chosen but finally accepted. The command center's doors opened to admit faces Marcus hadn't seen in months, colleagues who'd maintained careful distance while he'd struggled with phantom pain and psychological isolation. Now they approached with the deference accorded someone who'd proven leadership transcended physical capability. "Captain Thorne." Commissioner Williams extended his hand with genuine warmth rather than obligatory sympathy. "The response you coordinated, 37 simultaneous threats neutralized, 0 civilian casualties, constitutional crisis averted. I've never witnessed operational command at that level." Marcus accepted the handshake, noting Williams' surprise at his grip strength. 3 years of wheelchair navigation had built different muscle groups, compensation becoming capability. "I had advantages the conspirators didn't anticipate," he replied. "They expected someone diminished by injury. Instead, they faced someone refined by it." Patricia approached with documents that would reshape historical understanding, Princess Charlotte's true story, genealogical evidence of 2 centuries of manipulation, proof that constitutional monarchy had survived not through luck, but through the dedication of people willing to sacrifice personal safety for institutional preservation. "The historians are calling it the most significant discovery since the Tower Ravens," she said, though her tone suggested she understood the real significance lay not in academic revelation, but in the living truth they demonstrated. Charlotte wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was defending the crown against the same forces we just defeated. Marcus nodded, remembering that foggy November evening in Windsor's Courtyard when Zeus had first detected something his human partner couldn't perceive. Whether supernatural intervention or subconscious pattern recognition, Charlotte's voice had guided him toward understanding that some duties transcended individual existence. "The memorial service," he said, making a decision that felt inevitable. "I want to attend Princess Charlotte's rededication ceremony at Windsor. She deserves recognition for what she really died defending." Zeus's tail wagged once, as if approving the choice. The dog had always possessed instincts that training enhanced rather than created, loyalty that deepened under pressure, courage that emerged when needed most. Marcus understood now that his own transformation followed similar patterns. The wheelchair's modified systems hummed quietly as he maneuvered through corridors that 3 years ago he'd believed would never welcome him again. But the palace hadn't changed. His relationship to it had evolved. Where he'd once seen accommodation for disability, he now recognized adaptation for different capability. "Captain," a young sergeant approached with the formal bearing that Marcus remembered from his own early years. "Sir, the teams wanted to express their gratitude. Your coordination saved lives today." Marcus studied the younger man's face, seeing determination unmarked by the compromises that experience inevitably demanded. Once that eagerness had been his own. Now he offered something more valuable, proof that service could survive any transformation, that duty remained possible regardless of physical limitation. "Service isn't about what you're capable of," Marcus replied, words carrying weight earned through years of doubt finally resolved. It's about what you choose to do with the capabilities you have. Zeus rose from beside the wheelchair, stretching muscles that had been suppressed too long but retained their strength. Together they moved toward windows overlooking the courtyard where this had begun. Man and dog, partners by choice rather than necessity, guardians of institutions that endured because people like them chose purpose over comfort. The coronation would proceed tomorrow as scheduled. Constitutional monarchy would continue, not because it was invulnerable, but because each generation found guardians willing to pay the price of its preservation. Marcus Thorne had returned to his world, forever changed but finally whole. Chapter 18. The New Beginning. 6 months after the coronation, Marcus wheeled through Windsor Castle's corridors with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. The phantom pain had never returned, replaced by something more valuable, the bone-deep satisfaction of duty fulfilled and purpose redefined. Zeus padded beside him, no longer wearing the service collar but choosing to remain close. Their partnership evolved beyond necessity into genuine companionship. "The Princess Charlotte Memorial Garden is ready for dedication, sir," reported Sergeant Davies, the young officer who'd thanked him that November evening. 6 months of working under Marcus had transformed the eager recruit into a capable guardian, proof that wisdom could be transmitted across generations of service. Marcus nodded, remembering the foggy night when this had all begun, when Zeus had snarled at an empty bench and led him toward a truth that spanned 2 centuries. The memorial garden now occupied that same courtyard space, a living tribute to a princess whose courage had finally received proper recognition. "Any word from the Historical Commission?" Marcus asked as they approached the East Wing, where his new office overlooked the Thames. The view reminded him daily that some currents ran deeper than individual lives, carrying forward purposes larger than personal ambition. "The genealogical investigation is complete," Davies replied, consulting his tablet. 17 families linked to the original conspiracy, their inherited wealth traced back to properties stolen after Princess Charlotte's murder. Parliament's debating reparations legislation. The scope still amazed Marcus. 200 years of patient manipulation, marriages arranged, and inheritances diverted, all to position one bloodline for eventual control of the crown. Princess Charlotte had died defending against the same forces they'd faced, her warnings preserved in whispers that Zeus had somehow detected. His wheelchair's adaptive systems hummed quietly as they entered the command center, now reconfigured to accommodate his preferred operational style. Multiple monitors displayed security feeds from across the royal properties, but the frantic urgency of that November evening had been replaced by routine vigilance. The conspiracy's defeat had eliminated an immediate threat, but eternal watchfulness remained the price of constitutional preservation. "Captain Thorne," came Commissioner Williams' voice through the secure line. "Final confirmation, the last of Ashworth's international cells has been neutralized. Switzerland confirmed the arrests an hour ago." Marcus smiled, remembering Williams' surprise at discovering a wheelchair-bound officer commanding the most complex counter-terrorism operation in British history. The Commissioner's initial skepticism had transformed into genuine respect, proof that competence ultimately transcended physical limitation. "Outstanding work, Commissioner," Marcus replied. "What's the status on the memorial ceremony?" "Her Royal Highness will attend personally," Williams reported. "The Princess specifically requested that you provide escort duty during the dedication." The honor carried weight beyond protocol. Royal protection assignments were reserved for the most trusted guardians, those whose loyalty had been tested under fire. That the Crown would entrust him with such responsibility validated everything he'd fought to prove, that adaptation could enhance rather than diminish capability. Zeus stretched beside his workstation, the gesture relaxed rather than alert. The dog's chemical suppression had left no permanent damage, revealing intelligence and courage that 3 years of manipulation had hidden. Their relationship had deepened beyond handler and service animal into true partnership, mutual respect between guardians who'd chosen duty over comfort. Sir Davies approached with the morning briefings. The new training protocols you developed, they're being implemented across all royal properties. The integration of adaptive technologies with traditional security measures. Marcus reviewed the documents with satisfaction. His experience had revealed advantages that conventional thinking had overlooked: mobility systems that provided unexpected tactical options, communication arrays that enhanced rather than limited operational capability. What had begun as accommodation for disability had evolved into innovation that benefited everyone. Patricia entered carrying files that still amazed historians. Princess Charlotte's true story, documented evidence of her resistance to the conspiracy, proof that her death had been murder rather than suicide. The young princess had understood threats that her contemporaries had dismissed, dying to preserve institutions she'd believed were worth any sacrifice. The museum exhibition opens next month, Patricia reported. Charlotte's story, the conspiracy's exposure, your investigation, all of it preserved for future generations. The truth finally told. Marcus nodded, understanding that their success carried responsibility beyond immediate victory. Each generation faced similar choices between personal safety and institutional preservation, individual comfort and collective duty. Their example would endure only if its lessons remained accessible to those who came after. The afternoon sun streamed through windows overlooking the courtyard where Princess Charlotte's memorial garden was taking final shape. Native flowers and herbs arranged in patterns that honored both beauty and purpose, living testimony that some sacrifices produced growth rather than endings. Zeus rose and moved to the window, tail wagging as he watched gardeners tending plants that would bloom for decades. The dog understood permanence in ways that transcended human comprehension, finding satisfaction in achievements that outlasted individual existence. Marcus joined him at the window, man and dog united in quiet contemplation of work completed and duties fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh threats to institutions that endured only through constant vigilance. But today offered something rare in their profession: the certainty that they'd proven worthy of trust placed in them. Constitutional monarchy would continue, protected by guardians who understood that true strength adapted to any circumstance, that service transcended limitation, that duty remained possible regardless of the forms it took. Captain Marcus Thorne had found his new beginning, forever changed but finally completely whole.